Let us be perfectly clear from the start. The idea that slavery was invented by Europeans and inflicted only upon Africans is a profound misunderstanding of history. This institution, one of humanity's most tragic and enduring failures, is not the story of one race or one continent. It is a global phenomenon, ancient and widespread, with roots that sink deep into the soil of almost every civilization on Earth. To understand slavery, we must look beyond the familiar narrative of the Atlantic world. We must have the courage to examine the past in its full, uncomfortable complexity, acknowledging that the practice of enslaving fellow human beings crossed lines of culture, religion, and geography for thousands of years before the first European ship reached the coast of West Africa. The story so often told focuses on a specific period and a specific trade, and while that story is vital, it is incomplete. By narrowing our lens, we risk simplifying a vast and intricate history into a simple tale of heroes and villains. But history is rarely so straightforward. A brutal reality for people on every continent. People were enslaved after wars as punishment for crimes to pay off debts because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Long before the era of European colonial expansion, slavery was an accepted part of the social and economic order in countless societies across the globe. In the ancient Near East, the cradle of civilization, legal codes, detailed the rights of slave owners and the status of the enslaved. Captives taken during military campaigns were forced into labor, mines, and the households of the elite. These were not systems based on modern concepts of race. Slavery was often the bitter consequence of war, conquest, or debt. It was a status that could befall anyone. The Roman Empire was, in many respects, a slave society, worked in every conceivable role: farm hands, miners, domestic servants, and even as educated tutors and administrators. A desperate, bloody testament to the brutality of this system and the universal desire for freedom. These ancient examples establish a fundamental truth. Slavery is not a modern invention, nor tied to a single culture. While the transatlantic slave trade looms large in Western memory, it was not the only large-scale, systematic movement of enslaved Africans. For centuries, two other vast networks were operating: the trans-Saharan trade, the Indian Ocean trade. These routes, primarily managed by Muslim traders, moved millions of people to North Africa, the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, South Asia. The trans-Saharan trade transported gold, salt, spices, human beings across the vast and unforgiving desert. These journeys were perilous, and the trade lasted for over a millennium, from the 7th century well into the 19th. Historians, such as Ralph Austin, have worked to piece together the scale of this human trafficking. While precise figures are impossible to obtain, for the trans-Saharan trade alone, estimates often range from 6 to 7 million people over its 1,200-year history. The Indian Ocean trade moved people from the Swahili coast to Arabia, Persia, the islands of the Indian Ocean, is estimated to have transported several million more. Together, comparable in scale over a longer duration to the Atlantic trade. They were sought as soldiers, domestic servants, concubines, water carriers, administrators. Unlike the plantation-based slavery of the Americas, the labor was not concentrated in a single industry. However, this did not necessarily mean the conditions were better. In some regions, the labor was as brutal and deadly as any found in the New World. The Zanj Rebellion highlights the extreme exploitation that existed. These eastern slave trades profoundly reshaped societies on both sides of the exchange. The Sidi in India and Pakistan, the Afro-Iraqis. The sheer numbers behind every digit was a human life, a story of terror, loss, and survival. Marched for hundreds of miles into markets on the coast, across the desert. Captives faced starvation, dehydration, extreme violence. They were often chained, yoked together to prevent escape. Those who could not keep up were frequently left to die, bleached bones. A grim testament. One of the most brutal practices was the creation of eunuchs, Many enslaved boys and men were subjected to castration, with an appallingly high mortality rate. Eunuchs were valued as harem guards, administrators, servants. Death rates on these eastern routes are debated, but clearly devastatingly high. The Middle Passage is often estimated at 10 to 20%. The Sahara crossing could have been even deadlier. Patrick Manning suggested that for every person who reached the end market, another may have died during the initial raid, the long march, or across the desert. Survivors' lives in bondage varied, but were always defined by the loss of freedom. Enslaved women were often forced into domestic service or sexual slavery as concubines. Their children often remained precarious, a permanent underclass, a human cost measured in deaths and generations of stolen liberty. The story of slavery often casts Europeans solely in the role of perpetrators, but history reveals a more complicated picture where they were also victims. From the 16th to the early 19th centuries, terror came from the Barbary corsairs in what were known as the Barbary states: Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli. These were not random acts, but a state-sanctioned enterprise of raiding and slave-taking. Their ships prowled the seas, galleys and sailing vessels, attacking ships from every European nation. They launched devastating raids known as razzias on coastal towns and villages, with entire communities being emptied of their people in a single night. Their reach extended into the Atlantic, Canary Islands, Madeira, the British Isles, even Iceland. One infamous example, the sack of Baltimore, County Cork, in June 1631. In a single night, corsairs from Algiers captured 107 men, women and children, taking them back to North Africa to be sold into slavery. Scholar Robert Davis suggests the figures are significant. He estimates between 1 and 1.25 million Europeans were enslaved in North Africa from 1530 to 1780. Many were put to hard labor as galley slaves, others in construction, quarries, or as domestic servants. It forced maritime nations to pay tribute. Religious orders formed to ransom captives, the Trinitarians, the Mercedarians. Barbary captivity became a literary genre. This is a stark reminder that enslaving people by religion or origin was not one-sided, and that for centuries, to be a European living near the coast meant facing the very real threat of being captured and sold into bondage. To understand the mechanics of the transatlantic slave trade, we must look honestly at the African continent itself and the complex role that African rulers, states, and merchants played. The arrival of European traders did not create a slave trade from scratch. It tapped into pre-existing systems and massively expanded them. When European ships began offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum in exchange for people, many African polities saw a powerful economic and political opportunity. Oyo, Asante, the Kingdom of Congo, and smaller states became deeply involved. They waged wars, launched raids to capture people for sale to Europeans in coastal forts and ships. The trade in human beings became a central part of their economies and a key instrument of state power. More guns led to more successful slave raids, which provided more captives to trade for more guns. A stark example is the Kingdom of Dahomey in modern-day Benin. From the 18th century, a highly militarized state whose economy depended on capturing and selling its neighbors. Annual campaigns acquired captives, marched to ports like Ouidah, and sold to European traders. The royal court grew immensely wealthy, turning the trade into a state monopoly. This involvement does not excuse the European buyers or diminish the horror of the overall system. The demand from the Americas was the primary driver that escalated the trade to an unprecedented and catastrophic scale. Ignoring the agency and participation of African actors presents an incomplete and paternalistic view of history. It reveals how the corrosive logic of the slave trade ensnared and corrupted societies on both sides of the Atlantic. The transatlantic slave trade remains the most studied and widely discussed slave system in history, and for good reason. Over approximately 4 centuries, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were transported. About 10.7 million survived the Middle Passage. Placing the transatlantic trade alongside the other slave trades does not lessen its significance. It highlights its unique and terrible characteristics. Distinct in industrial scale, agricultural focus, and its rigid, pseudo-scientific racism. Unlike many ancient or Eastern forms where manumission was sometimes possible, American chattel slavery was overwhelmingly hereditary and permanent. Comparing the numbers is instructive. The Eastern trades together might range from 10 to 18 million over more than a millennium, yet the Atlantic moved more people in a shorter time. Understand the Atlantic trade not as isolated, but as the most concentrated, commercially efficient manifestation of a practice haunting humanity for millennia. When we confront the global history of slavery, we are untangling a complex web of interconnected systems. It is crucial to be careful with numbers. Ship logs, tax records, census data, fragmented sources. They give us a sense of scale, but each number was a person with a family, a home, and a life that was stolen. Recognizing the global nature of slavery is not a balance sheet of blame. It forces us beyond simplistic narratives. Power, profit, prejudice, many societies proved capable of profound inhumanity. This nuanced understanding protects us from weaponizing history today. History is always more complex than the stories we prefer to tell. The enslavement of human beings was not the invention of one culture, race, or religion. It was a global tragedy, a dark thread in humanity's history. We owe it to millions who suffered and to future generations to tell the whole story. Only by confronting our past's entirety can we hope to build a future where no human is treated as property.